I'm Looney Politics columnist Dale Smith, and we had a close call with the trade negotiations with the US because one of the items that was possibly up for consideration was the Online News Act. Now, this has been circulating around media sources that this was one of the areas where Carney was willing to capitulate on, possibly as part of some kind of digital trade alignment, which would have essentially surrendered Canadian sovereignty over digital spaces and our ability to regulate web giants, particularly things like Google and Facebook. And that's important in the context of the Online News Act because there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what exactly the Act is doing with regards to those two main organizations. Now, partially because the former government explained things very badly and misleadingly in some cases, but the notion that the Act is some kind of a link tax for these services for hosting links was always wrong. It was because Google and Facebook in particular have a monopoly over the digital ad market, and the way in which their monopoly works, because they own all of the pieces in the middle, they extract money and value all along the chain so that digital advertising money that used to go to media outlets now mostly goes to Google and Facebook, and the media outlets only get a small portion of what they used to get because of how the system is now rigged. Now, the Online News Act was supposed to be a kind of a redress for that because of this monopolistic behavior without actually breaking up those companies. But as we remember, both of those companies threw absolute tantrums. Facebook insisted that they weren't going to host news anymore after spending years convincing everyone that they needed to host their news on Facebook. Because they didn't want to have the power of this monopoly removed from themselves or to have to pay for their monopolistic behavior. Similarly with Google, they came to an agreement for a lump sum, essentially on the condition that they're not going to be regulated on other things. But again, they're abusing their monopolistic power, which is how this came about in the first place. And it raises a lot of questions as to what exactly the government was planning to do if they surrendered this as part of a trade deal. Now, would that mean that they would have to replace that income going to media outlets with government funds? Because that's a whole other can of worms, especially when it comes to things like the accusations that media is now bought and paid for by the government, so on and so on. That was a fight that I don't know that Carney could have won. And it would have been especially bad in Quebec, where Quebec media is also very much dependent on this, but it's also much more central to the political and economic and cultural considerations in the province. And alienating Quebec is probably not something he would have wanted to try and do as part of this trade deal he was trying to get. So we had a close call, and it's raising a lot of questions as to whether this was something he was actually going to surrender to the Americans on for the sake of getting a bad deal that was never really on the table in the first place, because no deal the Americans sign at this point in time can be trusted. So whether this was a capitulation that was in the making or not remains to be seen, but it raises a lot of questions that we should be getting answers to. For Looney Politics, I'm Dale Smith.